All right, so we're going to get started. Thank you very much for attending. Today, we are talking about growing a disability inclusive culture in the workplace. I'm sorry, it's not titled like that, but you guys know all I talk about is employment. So we'll just pretend like it silently said that. I want to give a special thanks, excuse me, to my partners. The Human Services Forum, Becca is here today helping out. I could not do these webinars without your assistance. You've been such a fabulous partner throughout this whole year, and I so appreciate everything that you've done for me to help me make sure that I can deliver decent content to the audience. So again, thank you, Human Services Forum. So why do we need this webinar? Always a question people are asking. I want to answer it up front. Disability is different than other diversity groups. Everybody says that, you know, my group's different, my group's different. But in this case, it's actually true because the approach that we use for the other general diversity groups, race, gender, ethnicity, things like that, those approaches don't necessarily work for disability. And so that's why we say it's not quite the same when you have an approach to a diversity, to an inclusive culture across diversity. You do have to pay a special attention to disability and make sure that the approaches that you've got going are working for people with disabilities. We know it's not working because the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is still just about double what it is for people without disabilities. And we know, we've seen, people with disabilities are very capable, but we've got to find better ways to bring them in and to include them. So to answer the question, isn't diversity inclusion inclusive of disability? Not necessarily. And so that's why we're having this webinar today, to just talk about different approaches, things that you can track, things you can think about that will allow you to help your company become more disability inclusive in the workplace. So a couple of quick things. This webinar is being recorded, so you are on a recording right now, and we do that so we can make it available to those who couldn't attend, or if you want to check things later on. But we want your interaction. So please use the chat and the hand raising. And just in case you're not familiar with those, I'm going to cover them real quickly. If you want to use the chat, you just go down to your toolbar or up to your toolbar, wherever it is on your screen, and you click on the thing that looks like a little speech bubble. And when you do that, a window will pop up and you can type in whatever you want. Within that window, it also says, who do you want to direct the chat to? So if you want to tell everybody what you've got or the questions you've got, please type everyone. If you want it to be private, you can just type in or click on panelists, and it will just go to Becca and I. However, we do hope that you will make your comments and your questions public so it benefits everybody, really does. And so we really appreciate it when you are able to give the comments and the questions to everybody. Okay, raising your hand on your toolbar. There's something that kind of looks like a smiley face with a plus button. It says reactions on there. If you click on that, you get this menu. And on this menu, you can raise your hand. You can also clap, you can give a thumbs up, you can vote no, whatever. But the feature that I'm really interested in, and we think it really helps, is to raise your hand. Once you've raised your hand, Becca can let me know that you've got a question, and then we can answer your question, and then you can lower your hand. Or if during the presentation, because I haven't stopped talking, I've answered your question, you can lower your hand as well. If you don't lower your hand, your arm will get very tired and your hand will be up in the air the entire presentation. So my objectives for today are to define disability inclusive culture, to share 5 steps that you can take to increase disability inclusion, to grow disability inclusive culture, and to discuss the typical hurdles that you might experience in your journey to creating a more disability inclusive culture. But I'm very curious in what your objectives are. So I would love it if you would type into the chat, either define, steps, or hurdles. And again, that stands for you're voting for either that you want me to define the disability inclusive culture, you want me to share 5 steps you can take, or discuss the typical hurdles. I will talk about all of them, but your votes do help me think about prioritizing and spending as much time as possible in the areas that you have the most interest in. So I'm going to check the chat and see what it says. It looks like it's an even distribution. Everybody wins because everybody wants to see the same thing. So we'll keep going forward. Please keep in mind, this is being recorded. So when you put questions out there, it could be for the for the general public, keep that in mind. But I do this so you don't have to take notes. You can take screenshots of this if you want to at any point in time. And of course, the replay will be sent later on. I've been getting kind of delinquent in doing it in the next day or 2 days. So I'm not going to promise it anymore that it'll happen in 2 days, because I caption it and I want to check the captioning first and make sure that it's accurate before we post the replay. So, but you will get an email and that will help you be able to see this again if you want to. Also with that replay, we send any links that were sent in the chat or discussed in the presentation. Those are called out also in the when I send the link to the replay. So at this point, I want to introduce myself, because people wonder, well, who's Deb Russell? Why is she somebody that I should be listening to about this? So I just want to give you a little background on me. I started my career helping people with disabilities get jobs. I was a special education teacher for a while, doing skill development. I was a job coach and a job developer. I worked with employers, helping them employ people with disabilities that I was providing services to. And then I ran some programs like that, and I went to work for the government for a while, trying to change their programs focused on helping people with disabilities find jobs. That was the first 15 years of my career, and it was a great time. I learned a lot and had an opportunity to really influence some people. But the pinnacle of my career happened in 2006 when Walgreens invited me to come and help them figure out how to employ people with disabilities. This was the first time that a company was looking enterprise-wide in our country and saying, we want to do this everywhere. We want to figure out, how do we become a good employer for people with disabilities? And we want to do it in a way that makes sense for the business case. It was kind of terminology that wasn't very familiar to the disability community until we started really talking about it at Walgreens. And what it means is that we wanted to make sure that what we created, the initiatives, the policies, the procedures, everything that we did was within the context of making sure that it was fair to the employees, to the customers, and to the shareholders, meaning it needed to be budget neutral. Everything that I did needed to be very focused on ensuring that the people with disabilities that we were bringing in were going to be performing at the same levels as everybody else, to ensure that when we approached partners on this, that they understood that we weren't just going to be hiring anybody with a disability. That wasn't the point. The point was to find the people with disabilities who could do our jobs, and also to look at our workplace and determine, how do we make it more accessible? How do we create supportive training programs, partnerships, things like that, that will help to ensure that we are a good employer of people with disabilities and offering them a good opportunity. So it was a very long journey. It took us 7 years to get to the place where I left the company, and the leader, the champion of this, he also left the company, but the company was in a very good place. And they've continued on since then, really focused on employing people with disabilities. They talk about it all the time. If you just go to their most recent annual report, they're discussing this in that. We started with the distribution centers. We took what we learned, we applied it to the stores and created programs for them to employ more people with disabilities. And then we took it to the corporate body and infiltrated every part of the company that we could to do this. So I say all of that because in the end, we created a disability inclusive culture. We didn't know what that meant. It wasn't with intention to do that, because we just didn't know that that was something that would be needed. But as we grew the initiative, as we continued to have more success, what we found was that we had a disability inclusive culture in our workplaces, where we had a significant portion of the workforce being people with disabilities. It actually was around 9 to 10% of the workforce, people with disabilities representing that part of it. Then we saw the factors of the disability inclusive culture that we'll talk about today. So a lot of my presentation today is really about what I learned at Walgreens by accident. But hindsight's always 20/20, and I was able to look back and say, what created that? And how did we know we were there? And those are kind of things that I'm going to talk about. What hurdles did we run into? Because even though Walgreens approached me and their leadership said, we want to do this, it doesn't mean that we were barrier free. We experienced a lot of barriers, some of them unintended, some of them completely unrealized until they cropped up. So again, I'm going to talk about that today. So let's start by defining disability inclusive culture. And I think that that's important before we talk about how or the hurdles, because what are we talking about? When I say defining a disability inclusive culture, there isn't currently a scorecard for that at this time. There are scorecards for other factors related to disability inclusion, but not for a disability inclusive culture. But some of the scorecards that are out there, there are several groups that do surveys and have some pretty robust instruments that they use to gauge whether a company's got policies that are in place that are best practices, whether they're doing things that really we know lead toward disability inclusive culture, but nobody's figured out how to measure it yet. So I'm going to define it, but just realize that we don't have any, strict parameters right now for defining disability inclusive culture. But the first one is that it assumes capability. That's, I think, the most important part of all this is that we don't assume that people with disabilities can't do our jobs. We are the opposite. We assume they can until they prove otherwise. Not everybody, of course, not everybody. Not everybody without a disability can do these jobs. And so disability is separated from incapability in a disability inclusive culture. And I love when things happen on LinkedIn or in the news that are relevant to what I'm talking about today, because this past week, there was a discussion on LinkedIn about a company that had completely thrown out all of their HR systems to recruit people with disabilities, to screen people with disabilities, to interview them, to determine whether they were eligible. They threw out the idea that they wanted resumes. They just said, if you show up, we'll give you a job. It was really a very innovative approach. This story was talked about. It was in Australia. And it was promoted on LinkedIn. And there was a lot of discussion after that saying, well, I can't lift things, so it's not inclusive. And I thought it was an interesting response, because what does inclusive mean? It means it can't mean everybody. It doesn't mean universal. It just means that we're breaking down the barriers that we know exist and trying harder and harder. Ironically enough, 2 days after I read this conversation going on LinkedIn, it was promoted on a different company doing the same thing, was promoted on ABC News. They were talking about a brownie company in, I think it was in New Jersey, that anybody who comes in gets a job. Some of the people there, they've got criminal backgrounds or other things, gaps in their resume, sort of things that typically right now get you screened out of the opportunity to show that you can do a job. And that's what they were doing. They're just providing that opportunity. So I like that they removed that assumption that disability means you can't do the jobs. A disability inclusive culture assumes that disability is not really a big factor in whether or not you are able to do a job. Your skill sets, of course, but not your disability. The next thing that I think is so important in defining a disability inclusive culture is equal access. And I know I've showed you guys this cartoon before. It's just such a great representation of what it means to talk about equality versus equity. Because in equality, everybody gets the same thing. But if you don't start out with the same thing, then you don't end up with the same things. So equity is about providing the same opportunity. So this visual is just a great way of showing that. On the left-hand side, it says equality, and it shows 3 people of different heights, all standing on the same leveled box, trying to look over a fence at a baseball game. And one person's incredibly tall on that box looking out over the fence. One person can just look over it, and one other person has to look through a hole in the fence to be able to see the baseball game. And on the right-hand side, same baseball game, same fence, same 3 people, but it's equity. And it shows that the tall person who doesn't need a box is not standing on a box anymore. The medium-sized person who could just see over the fence with a box, he's still standing on one box. But the individual who is much shorter and even standing on one box, couldn't see over the fence, is now standing on 2 boxes, and now he can see over the fence. So it's just such a great way of saying treating everybody exactly the same isn't what we're aiming for. Because if you don't start out with the same thing and then you just get this, if you start with 1 and 4 and you add 2, well, you've only got 3 and 6. You still aren't the same. So, or you still aren't in the same place. So it's much more about the access to opportunity than giving everybody exactly the same thing. And that's what we found at Walgreens. We actually had to create different recruiting systems for people with disabilities because our existing recruiting system assumed somebody would work before they got there, and everything was based on that. All the scoring we had was based on that. So we had to eliminate that scoring mechanism and be able to really look at people with disabilities in a different way than we were looking at everybody else. Those scoring systems, they have a purpose. They do help companies to be able to really cull through the masses of people that are applying for jobs and be able to pull those from the general masses, who's likely to be successful in there. But for the people with disabilities who don't even have a chance in there, we had to create a different mechanism. And it really allowed people with disabilities, people with other barriers who would just be automatically screened out, not for a very good reason, to be able to have access. So that was really an important thing. And I think it's so important when we look at disability inclusive cultures, ensuring that there is effort and a lot of attention paid to equal access. All right, so let's talk about communicating loud and proud. This is something I see in disability inclusive cultures. They are talking about what they're doing, that they're trying to employ people with disabilities. They are trying to make things more accessible and more equal for people with disabilities, create that equity. And the fact that they're trying is what I think is key in that communication. Because if we wait until everything's perfect with disability inclusion, we'll never get there. So that loud and proud communication about we're trying to get there. We've had these wins, we still have these challenges we're working on. That communication really demonstrates disability inclusion and the importance of disability inclusion, what the company's doing. Because disability needs to be the key ingredient in strategy. Not saying that strategy wraps around disability, but that they think about disability across the strategy. If the business's strategy is to reach more customers, are we considering how to reach customers with disabilities? If the business's strategy is to target certain geographic areas, are those geographic areas that are accessible to people with disabilities? If you want to build a store in a big building, does it have an elevator? Those sorts of things. Not necessarily that it's driving the strategy, but that it's a piece of it every time. I think that Microsoft has done a great job of this. I know not everybody's like Microsoft, but when they develop new products, I think I should say IBM does this too. When they develop new products, it goes through accessibility testing through every iteration of it. And if it doesn't pass accessibility testing, it doesn't pass. It can't move forward until they fix those glitches. And it's interesting that the company would invest so much money up front for accessibility instead of just building it and then checking the accessibility and fixing it later. They've definitely made a statement about disability inclusion, and that's reflected in their workforce as well, not just in the products that they sell. So I think that making sure that disability is a key component of strategy, the effort for disability is a key component of strategy, is an indicator of defining a disability inclusive work culture. And finally, if a company doesn't reward creativity, then I don't think that they're a very disability inclusive place. We need creativity right now. We need flexibility right now. We are just on the verge of inclusion right now. We don't know enough to think that we know it all. And the only way we can learn is by making mistakes. So encouraging and giving permission for managers to make mistakes, for other people who are making key decisions within the business to try things. At Walgreens, it was very cool because if people weren't making mistakes, they actually got a negative mark on their performance because it meant you weren't trying new things. It meant you weren't exploring ways to make things work better. And so that was it. Instead of our managers or other decision makers being afraid of making mistakes, afraid that they would be chastised or penalized in some way for making that mistake, it was the reverse. They were actually chastised for not making mistakes. It just meant we weren't pushing the envelope. We weren't trying things. We weren't being creative in how we were going to approach things. And that was such a great lesson learned for me on how to assist companies with thinking through this. If they're not making any mistakes, they're really not trying very hard. That's how we all learn. We're humans. That's how we learn, is by making mistakes. You will never learn how to walk if you don't fall down first. Maybe that's wrong. That's what I'm sticking to. Okay, let's talk about 5 steps to building a disability inclusive culture. There's probably more than this, but I'm going to give you 5. Plan for the entire employment life cycle. It is very challenging to me when I'm working with companies and they say, well, we want to talk about recruiting people with disabilities, because they're leaving off everybody who's already in their workforce who has a disability. They're really neglecting the information that says that 75% of disabilities are invisible. People with disabilities are already there. We're just trying to make it more inclusive, make it more welcoming, make them feel more comfortable identifying that part of their life. So you want to talk about the entire life cycle, not just recruiting, training, onboarding, managing, promoting, all of that. What did I miss? That's really important to think about. How do we become more disability inclusive across all of that, not just in recruiting? So creating those plans for the entire life cycle, wanting to make sure that when we are talking about and targeting people with disabilities, talking about and targeting disability inclusion, we're talking about everything within the company. And then communicate that plan. Make that plan very holistic and communicate it. Again, just like I was saying, that's an indicator of disability inclusive culture, is talking about what you're planning on doing. When I started at Walgreens, we had a big question, how do we determine our success in this? I mean, we knew how many people with disabilities we wanted to employ, but we were looking for other factors. And I said, I think it's when we stop talking about this. It just becomes how we do things. And I'll tell you right now, they're still not there. It was very naive of me to offer that as a success indicator. I think it will take a long time for all of us to get there. However, I then offered that when we fire somebody with a disability, that we are successful in employing people with disabilities, because we're holding them to standards. We're really making sure that they are doing what we have asked them to do, and they're being held accountable for that. Communicating that in the plan felt very risky, but we put it out there. We said, this is one of our markers. When we are actually holding people with disabilities to standard, that's really one part of our plan. So you want to measure and report on your progress. We had very clear, elevated goals. We wanted to achieve 10% of our workforce within our distribution division by 2010. That 10% of our workforce would be represented by people with disabilities. Didn't quite achieve that because the economy crashed. So we weren't hiring anybody, and you can't add more people with disabilities if you're not adding anybody else. But by 2011, we had achieved that 10% of the workforce in this entire division. So across 10,000 people, there were 1,000 people with disabilities. We actually got to 11% before I left the company. But that was the goal, keep going. It's not just, oh, we got to 10%, we're done. No, we're going to keep raising, because 20% of the US population are people with disabilities. Let's have equal representation, or aim for equal representation. But not only did we have that goal and that clear and elevating goal, but we reported on it every single month. A report went out. Where are we on this? And if managers were exceeding where we had them set up for their monthly goals, then that was great. Then they just, they got kudos and all that. And if they were slipping, then we were providing support. Well, how can we help? Why are the metrics lower this month than what we expected? And sometimes it had nothing to do with anything they could control. Okay, we'll just wait for that part to change and go back to the goal. Maybe we were resetting goals, providing support and tools, all of those things, but constantly keeping our eye on the prize and how metrics were going. You need to break down barriers as they arise. I can't tell you how many companies that we were working with after, as we were going through this, we started showing off what we were learning to other companies. They would say, well, we want it to be perfect before we start. We said, you'll never get there. It can't be perfect before you start, because you don't even know what the barriers are going to be. None of us know what is Walgreens going to encounter as a barrier next year. We don't know that yet. There hasn't been enough traction in there, enough history in this initiative, in these efforts, to be able to predict it all. And so we just have to be committed to breaking down the barriers as they arise. As the naysayers come up, we're going to push them away. As we bump into a problem, we're going to diagnose where's the problem coming from, what's the root cause, and how can we break through it, go around it, go over it, go under it, whatever it is to keep moving forward, or determine that it's a barrier that isn't going to move and figure out how else we're going to get where we're going. So you've got to be committed to breaking down those barriers as they come up, and not have them really throw you off. You should be expecting barriers. Again, if you're not making mistakes, then you're not trying very hard. If you're not running into barriers, I'm going to be really questioning whether you have truly a disability inclusive culture plan. And don't go it alone. Learn from other companies. There are so many companies now that love to show off their success that they found in some of their facilities. Nobody is all the way there yet, not even Walgreens, but got a lot of success, a lot of lessons learned, and we want to share that. So do other companies, Sephora, UPS, Pepsi, who else? I'm blanking, but it doesn't matter. There are other companies out there that are talking about their success and what they're doing, and they love to talk about it. They love to show it off. You want to go see a workplace that's time sensitive, that has a very low tolerance for errors, and see people with disabilities doing that jobs, you can go places and see that. It's really important to not do this alone. Learn from the lessons that have come before. Engage with your community resources. Every community has services for people with disabilities. Engage with them. That's a great way to think about recruiting and learning. How do I bring more people with disabilities into my workplace to do the jobs that I have? Look for the experts. This is a very young industry. There aren't that many of us out there yet, but more and more people are learning how to help companies be successful in this. And I do suggest that when you're looking for expertise to help you with this, don't go with someone who's only worked with one company. When I worked with Walgreens, I knew only how to make Walgreens successful. And it was through my next batch of customers. That's where I really learned how to look at this from any company's perspective and be able to really create good plans and strategies on how to impact what they were working on. Attend free seminars like this one. There are free seminars all over the place about disability inclusion. Attend them. Get as much information as you can and take that back and figure out how it works for you. One thing I don't advise is to attend these kind of seminars and say, oh, well, she's talking about Walgreens and I'm not Walgreens, so I can't do that. No, the point is to tell you how it worked for Walgreens so that you can gather those kernels of help that will work in your situation. And then connect with employees with disabilities. Don't leave them out. You already have employees with disabilities. Maybe you can't get them to disclose, but if you can, ask their opinion or ask the disability community in general their opinion. People with disabilities in this community have a phrase called "nothing about us without us." And it's a pretty serious philosophy. So you want to be mindful of that and make sure that you're engaging with people with disabilities, not just people who know about people with disabilities, but engaging with people with disabilities as you go along to check in and make sure that what you're doing seems effective and helpful. So I'd love it if you could just take a moment to type into the chat, what else do you think would work? I'd just like to hear what other people are thinking about. I gave you 5 tips how to create a more inclusive, disability inclusive workplace culture. But what else could you do? Okay, one of the things that I've heard is the idea of putting in merit increases for making sure that people with disabilities are part of the decision making. And also thinking about how do we reward our leaders for taking these steps, for being willing to try these things. Some companies do offer incentives, merit pay for executives who are going into this area. So making sure that you are bringing in people with disabilities throughout what you're doing and having leadership be rewarded for those. Those are great things to think about in addition to the 5 things that I covered. So let's talk about the typical hurdles. What to be aware of. And I got some tips on how to manage them because it's never fun just to hear about the hurdles and not know what to do with them. So the first hurdle I expect in any place I go to that wants to talk about disability inclusion is that nobody believes that people with disabilities can do your job. I have a very complicated job. I have a lot of experience in my job. No person with a disability could do that job. And I want to get people to say those kinds of things because it allows us to provide some information. When you hear that, when I hear that, I know that whoever's saying it isn't thinking about everybody with a disability. They're thinking about a particular person with a disability or a person with a particular type of a disability. And so they're only thinking about disability through that lens, very narrow approach. And so one of the ways to help people who say, oh, people with disabilities can't do these kinds of jobs is to help individuals understand what's the full range we're talking about. People with disabilities is 20% of our population in the US. Again, 75% of the disabilities we can't see. And only 17% of people with disabilities are born with their disability. The rest of us, we're all acquiring them as we go through life. So although the typical assumption when you say people with disabilities, what pops into people's heads most of the time is somebody who's blind, who's using a white cane or a service dog, somebody who's deaf, who's signing, using sign language, or somebody with Down syndrome because they have some very specific physical characteristics. Sometimes people are thinking about individuals who use wheelchairs, but that's such a small percentage of people with disabilities across the board. And so they're forgetting about people like Richard Branson, who has a learning disability. I mean, he's incredibly successful. We can't possibly suggest that Richard Branson can do most of our jobs, at least the knowledge-based jobs, the strategic jobs. Maybe he can't lift, 100 pounds of something or other. I don't know what kind of physical fit. Oh no, he just went into space. He's probably got a lot of physical fitness too. He probably can do everything, I'm guessing. Again, when people think, oh, people with disabilities can't do these jobs, they're getting a very narrow view of disability. I don't want to argue with them about, whether a person with a wheelchair can do this job or somebody who's deaf can do this particular job. What I want to do is help them broaden their thoughts about disability. Who are we talking about when we say people with disabilities? Who are we including? We are including a lot of people who are already there and you can't see their disability. And we're including a lot of people whose disabilities we can see, but they haven't been able to get in there. So that assumption, again, it's when I hear that, and I hear it a lot, I can't tell you how much I hear it. Or the sort of side road of that hurdle is when they say, oh, well, I think a person with a disability can do this. And they're, kind of picking one small component of a job or one small component of their workplace. Again, they're just thinking about a person with a very particular disability. They may not even be an informed assumption about people with that particular kind of disability. But what we want to do is help people think much more broadly. If it helps, there's a quiz on my website. You guys have seen it before. And it is something that helps people broaden their thoughts about people with disabilities, including Richard Branson's in there. And what I'm asking is, here's a whole bunch of successful people. Which ones of them have disabilities? It's a really eye-opening experience for many, many people. Another hurdle is that you're told that doing any of these things that we're suggesting will put the company at legal risk. I hear that all day long as well. Lawyers are risk mitigators. They are risk averse. They are going to say, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But honestly, not doing anything is actually putting you at risk as well, because you're currently not including people with disabilities or not including as many people with disabilities as you could. And therefore, there is some level of discrimination. And I don't mean that in the big capital D discrimination, but just right now, we're putting up barriers. Things are inaccessible to people who could be doing these jobs, who have disabilities. And so to take the steps forward really does help mitigate that risk. It's a tough conversation, but what happened at Walgreens, when we started out, we got a lot of opinions from lawyers, and we kind of glommed onto the ones that said, yeah, you probably can do this safely. But about 3 years in, just keep in mind, Walgreens is a very large company. So they do get sued often, a lot more often than I thought they would, just being an average person. It turns out they get sued a lot, and they get sued for disability discrimination a lot from the customer's point of view. And what helped to fight those suits, or to even get them tossed out of court before they got to being a real case, was the fact that Walgreens had so much effort to employ more people with disabilities. Obviously, we were not this big bad company just, squashing people with disabilities, just keeping them out and not wanting to have them be our customers. The courts really took into consideration how much we were doing and the success we were having to bring people with disabilities into our workplace. That just really influenced the legitimacy of these kinds of discrimination costs. So I find that there is very little that has an increased legal risk when I'm suggesting things. I'm very mindful of what the laws are and what the legal parameters of things are. And sometimes it takes a long road to get the lawyers through there to see all of these opportunities. And you may need to spend some time talking to them about it, but just remember that doing nothing is a legal risk as well. The next thing that I hear that's so depressing and really just makes me feel pretty bad is when they say, well, this is how we do it. Don't rock that boat. Yes, you are going to try to do things differently. You are going to be changing things. But I want you to think about something that's a little bit, maybe share some history with you that might make you think differently about this. What I think is important to think about is that until 1920, only men voted. So women vote now. That's new. It's different. It's not the way they used to do it. Until 1969, man had never walked on the moon. Now we've got men who have walked on the moon. And I think what this one really hit me was until 1998, we were all saying, oh, I'm going to ask Jeeves when we were looking for something on the internet, or we were using Lycos or a web crawler or something like that, Alta Vista. And now all we do is Google or Bing, depending on whether you're a Microsoft or Google person. We don't use those old things anymore. Those things that were the standards back then are no longer the standards. So just because we don't do that this way now, doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it that way now. And so people who say, don't rock the boat, or this is how we do it, I would just remind them of what progress really means and what progress does for us individually and for our companies. All right, it requires effort. Yeah, it does. Nothing's free in life, but not doing something also requires some effort. So it's important, I think, to think about the business case for what you're proposing. If you want to help your company be more disability inclusive, you want to be very aware of the benefits of employing people with disabilities and what businesses can do and how they reap those benefits. So be familiar with the business case. And then when you're proposing something specific, build your business case around that particular thing. Whatever that particular thing is, build a business case around it. If you want to talk about how to increase the accessibility of your recruiting system, your applicant tracking system, well, do a little bit of research so that you can demonstrate why it's worth it for the company to make an investment. It does require investments, but progress always does. It doesn't just happen by accident. So this is just something you're going to hear it. And what you want to do is prepare yourself with business cases to ensure that the leadership is paying attention to why they should be paying attention to this stuff. Another hurdle is you don't know where to begin. And of course you don't. This is all new. And so when I send out the replay for the webinar, I've got 3 really great articles. I actually used them for some of this presentation. So I'm going to send the links to those articles. One of them is from the Harvard Business Review. They're just really wonderful articles written about how do you do this and why do you do this and things like that. So I just want you to know that you may not know where to begin. And you don't have to start with something as big as what Walgreens was doing. You could start small. Isn't that story about how do you eat an elephant? Well, it's one bite at a time. That's something to think about and really consider. These articles will help you, I think, give you some perspective, give you some stories, give you some tips. Make a list of what you think needs to be changed, prioritize it, and just tackle one at a time. or see where they can really dovetail with each other and complement each other to create an impact. Make a list of what needs to be fixed. Take some time, brainstorm, bring some people around, get a whiteboard up and start writing it out. What do we need to change? What do we want to change? How do we want it to change? Start thinking about it, dreaming, and then break it down to the individual steps and creating some plans for that. It might feel daunting, but again, eat an elephant one bite at a time. Anything we do takes one step. We can't walk without taking one step at a time. So just, although it seems big, you can really break it down, make it into manageable bits, and manage how you move forward with this. But don't stand still. Don't feel perplexed by how much there is to do. Pick something and start moving forward with it. I'm going to leave this as the last point in this webinar: encouraging and giving permission to make mistakes. I know some of you who come to these webinars are disability advocates and you're wanting to help companies do this. Give them a little grace to make mistakes, to try things that don't work. That's progress for us. That is inclusion. We want them to try things and to see how can they employ people with disabilities in a better way. What do they need to change? Sometimes they need to fail a couple of times. I can't tell you how many times at Walgreens I thought back on people who in the first year that we did it didn't end up being successful. And it's strictly because we didn't know enough yet. And so we weren't able to support them well enough to make them successful. There are going to be mistakes made, things where you look back and you go, oh, I wish I had known that now. I wish I'd known that back then, what I know now, whatever that metaphor is. So provide a little grace. And if you're the one leading this, offer the opportunity for people to make mistakes or require the opportunity for people to make mistakes. That is how we learn. That's how we're going to have progress. Quick reminder about the webinar series. This is the 11th one. Oh my gosh, we're almost done. Well, our first 6 were really devoted to the how and the why and some very specific components of a disability inclusive workplace strategy. And then we really dug into those tactical things: disability employment hiring, sourcing and hiring, and actually spent an entire webinar just on how to develop partnerships with disability sources. And then the last 2 were on inclusive management in general, and then performance management. How do we take somebody who is not doing well and address that without having disability be the barrier? So this one is about growing a disability culture, and our last one is going to be on refreshing your effort. Everybody who has started down this path has gotten to a point where they've gotten busy doing other things, or the world is changing and evolving. It's time for us to take a look at things, to say, maybe I need to do this differently, or maybe there's been leadership changes and we need to refresh the efforts. This is going to be about how to identify that and how to bring it in a very tactical way. So I hope you all look forward to that one. That I think will be a lot of fun. I actually have already had a request for that from somebody who said, we really need to get our efforts revitalized and we need to look at this in a different way because of changes in leadership. So I look forward to that that one. And we've got the link for applying for registering for those will of course come out with the links to those other articles. Does anybody have any questions? Please feel free to use the chat if you have questions on anything that I provided. If you have any questions about how I define a disability inclusive culture, please keep in mind. We really don't have any yardsticks for that yet, but there are ways to look at it, and really those are the things I think are crucial as aspects of it. When we looked at the steps you can take, and the hurdles, how do we break down those hurdles? You guys got any questions about any of those? I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, for your attention, for your participation. Really appreciate it. Becca, as always, thank you so much for supporting me in this webinar here and in all of them. Really appreciate it. If any of you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me on email, deb@debrussellinc.com, or to go to my website, www.debrussellinc.com. I'm not very original in my naming, but that's how it works. It just seemed a clear way for people to be able to find the information. I take these webinars when I record them, and I do put them up on my website, so they're available. The replays are available there and the resources that come with it. Thank you again, everybody. If you need anything, please let me know, and have a great day. Bye-bye.